Well, let's talk to the Russian-British social commentator and podcaster, Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin, you have been quite vocal on Twitter about this and the amount of things flurrying around, people throwing in their two-bit with opinions on everything from no-fly zones to sanctions and are worried about how this information being fed into the bigger system could potentially pose a huge risk.
Well, you've just heard quite a bit of it on your own program, Alex. Now, you know that for me, this is very personal. I have family in almost every part of Ukraine who are sheltering, some friends who are fleeing the region, etc. But some of the rhetoric that we are hearing now, I understand why Ukrainian journalists like the one you had on earlier would be calling for a no-fly zone, for example. But the idea that the West is going to start shooting down Russian planes, which is what a no-fly zone would involve, is asinine. It is insanity. Look, this conflict is only going to get resolved in one of three ways, either with the complete annihilation of Ukraine, or with the complete annihilation of the world, or it's going to end at the negotiating table. And what we have to do is get this to a position by supporting the Ukrainians, which we are doing very well, to fight for themselves, to secure and protect their country, and get Putin to a point where he's willing to negotiate. And at that point, everybody is going to need to be seen to have won this, because as you mentioned earlier in the program, Alex, 2/3 of Russian people support this. And the reason for that is very obvious. For the last several weeks, Russian state media, I'm not talking about the sort of stuff that you might see here in the West, like Russia Today or Sputnik or whatever. I'm talking about Russian state media in Russia has been telling their people a very different story. They're being told that there's a genocide of Russians happening in eastern Ukraine. They're being told that NATO and Ukraine are planning to invade Russia, or at least those two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine and so on. So Vladimir Putin is going to need to seem to have got some kind of win. And obviously the Ukrainian position is becoming more intractable as well, as they're able to stand up for themselves. So there are ways out of this, and I've suggested some of the ways forward, but they are going to be through negotiations, and we need to ratchet down this conversation about getting rid of Vladimir Putin, etc. I'm no fan of his or his policies whatsoever, but if you back him into a corner, this is a person who's got nuclear weapons, and as your historian guest said only a moment ago, Russia is not afraid to use them.
Yeah, I mean, the question there is who Vladimir Putin would listen to, because reportedly he has very few advisors surrounding him now. There has been some suggestion that people who could create an off-ramp, to use a US military term, could be people like President Xi of China, or perhaps the ex-German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who are two characters or two figures that people assume that Putin respects. Do you think that could be the way forward, or are we looking at essentially a massive concession, offering a chunk of Ukraine at the very least on a plate to Putin, which some might consider appeasement?
No, I don't think what we need here is appeasement at all, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But we are going to have negotiations. What we need to get to is a position where Ukraine gives Russia things that Ukraine doesn't care about losing, and Russia gets to save face, and Ukraine gets to have long-term security. So the way to do that, in my opinion, is to allow Ukraine to accept that Crimea isn't coming back, to accept these two eastern regions, which are not exactly helpful to Ukraine anyway. There's nobody really in Ukraine that thinks they're salvageable, even after what happened in 2014. So if you give Russia that, they can save face, and they already have de facto control of those regions since 8 years ago. So it's not a big loss for Ukraine. And on the other hand, you are going to have some kind of Western protection, whether there's some kind of peacekeepers on that border that then forms. That's the solution. This is not about appeasement. We have to make it clear that, Russia has to be seen internally, domestically, for their own people to have won, for them to have protected ethnic Russians and all of this other stuff. But from our position, we have to make it very clear that there's going to be things there in place for the long term, so that this can never happen again. Because as you know, I've mentioned previously that one of the reasons this has happened is the West has taken its eye off the ball. And my concern is, if we don't put things in place now, the next time we have a disputed election in America, or we're busy, dividing ourselves over some other cultural nonsense, then we will end up in a position where Putin is keen to expand further. So that's why you have to have a very strong negotiated settlement here that allows him to walk away with this, with saving face. But also, I think he's been shocked, and a lot of people in Russia have been shocked by the strength of the international response, and I think will act as a deterrent going forward.